On the surface, it was a great day for Jesus. As he made his way into Jerusalem, thousands lined the roadway. Many of them spread their cloaks on the road, as was fitting any king coming into the city. Others celebrated by waving their palms the coming of the Anointed One of God, the Messiah. It was indeed, on the surface, a great day for Jesus. And especially as he heard them singing, Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. But Jesus was not naive. Jesus knew the fickle hearts and minds of those there in that crowd, and he knew that in just a few days, many of those same ones shouting Hosanna would shout instead, crucify him, crucify him. Jesus knew the religious authorities had been planning and were even now planning his demise. The question on this Palm Sunday 2011 is, did Jesus have a choice? Was Jesus destined for the cross, or did he choose the cross? Was Jesus predetermined to be crucified, or did he choose crucifixion in obedience? I want to answer that question this morning by sharing with you 4 insights. First of all, I believe Jesus wanted his life and his teachings to change humanity. Did Jesus, when he began his public ministry at age 30 after being baptized at the Jordan River, believe that it was inevitable that he would end up on the cross? I don't think so. I think when Jesus began his public ministry, he began it passionate that his life and his teachings and his way of life would change the hearts and minds of men and women. I believe that when Jesus began his public ministry, he had the conviction that if I do this right, if I'm obedient to God, if I follow God's will, if I walk the path that God has in store for me, then humanity will be changed. I believe that when Jesus began his public ministry, he thought, I can plant seeds of the love of God and the kingdom of God, and the kingdom of God on earth will come. I do not for one moment believe that when Jesus launched his public ministry, that he had in his mind that his life and his teachings, his witness, would do other than change the hearts and minds of men and women. I believe that he believed he could bring hate to love, that he could bring injustice to justice, that he could move people from denigrating one another to loving one another. Secondly, I would say to you this morning that Jesus had free will just as you and I have free will. One of God's greatest gifts to us is the gift of free will. There's not a one of us in this sanctuary this morning who would want God to take away from us that gift, would you? If I asked you to take a vote this morning, if I said, would you want God to take away from you the gift of free will, knowing what free will often produces, there is not a single person in this sanctuary who would want God to take away from you that wonderful, wonderful gift of His. You know and I know that free will produces some of the most noble decisions ever made in humanity. Abraham Lincoln made the decision personally to put his presidency and his life on the line that slavery might be ended. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton put their comfort and their reputations on the line. They chose to do that for women's suffrage, that women might have the right to vote in this country. Martin Luther King Jr. put his life on the line because he believed that civil rights was something for which he should stand and that change should be made in this country. He made that decision willfully. Nelson Mandela knew that if he stood against that evil called apartheid, that he would most likely end up in prison, but he made the willful decision that he would go to the prison to fight apartheid, and as you know, he spent 27 years in prison in South Africa. But also, some of the most horrific decisions for humanity have been made out of free will. Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler had the free will to decide that he would bring Nazi Germany down upon the Jewish community. And so by the time the Holocaust was over, 6 million to 8 million Jews had died, and upward to 6 to 7 million other ethnic groups and disabled persons, all because one man had the free will to bring such evil. God knew when He gave humanity free will, we could choose right or we could choose wrong. We could choose what is just or we could choose what is unjust. We could choose to be obedient or we could choose to be disobedient. He gave us that privilege. Why in the world, I ask you, would God give you free will and not give His Son free will? Why in the world would God give Adolf Hitler free will and not give Jesus of Nazareth free will? The New Testament scholar William Barclay says it better than anyone in a book I recommend to you called Discovering Jesus. Barclay says this, listen carefully. Jesus' death was entirely voluntary. Jesus was not like some animal dragged to the sacrifice. Jesus voluntarily laid down His life because He chose to do so. Jesus was not caught up in a mesh of circumstances from which He could not break free. It is quite clear to the end that He could have turned back and saved His life. He did not lose His life, He gave it up. He was not killed, He chose to die. The cross was not thrust upon Jesus, Jesus willingly accepted it for us. There's a compelling verse in the 10th chapter of the Gospel of John where Jesus Himself tells us this. And it's interesting to me how few Christians have ever heard this passage or can remember this passage. When asked the question, did Jesus have the free will to say no? Listen to what Jesus says in John 10, verse 18. No one takes my life away from me. This is Jesus. No one takes my life away from me. I give my own life freely. Thirdly, I would say to you, Jesus chose the path of courage. He chose the path of courage toward the cross. Do you realize that there are over 20 million Christians in this world today who are persecuted? You and I worship freely in this beautiful sanctuary in this church called Germantown United Methodist Church. We have that opportunity, we have that privilege, we have the freedom to express our faith in this country, but that is not true for 20 million Christians in this country who find themselves, if they express their faith, abused, persecuted, imprisoned, even killed. Some say that in North Korea there are 50 to 70,000 Christians in forced labor. In Iran, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, Pakistan, they're not free to gather and worship like you and me. They gather and worship like you and I are, and they're going to be hauled off. Their jobs are going to be lost. Their families are going to be threatened. They're going to pay a price for their faith. They may even be killed. Why do they do it? Why do they do it? Why do they put their life on the line for the sake of the gospel? Because they follow a master who chose the path of courage. Because they remember the one who rode into Jerusalem on that Sunday and said, I will go to the cross in obedience to God. I will choose the path of courage. I will choose the path of faith. Jesus is a model for you and me of choosing the path of courage. And finally, I would say to you this morning that Jesus knew that some things are worth dying for. Do you have something worth dying for? Is there something worth dying for in your life? My guess is we parents would die for our children. My guess is we grandparents would die for our grandchildren. My hope is that each of us as citizens of this country, if necessary, would be willing to die for freedom and for this country. But what really is worth dying for? Well, let me tell you. Jesus believed that some things were worth dying for. He believed God's love for all humanity was worth dying for. He believed these confirmands right here this morning, like you and me, are worth dying for. He believed that God's desire that all human beings treat one another as God's children is worth dying for. He believed that God's design that love replaced hate and justice replaced injustice is worth dying for. He believed that God's will is worth dying for. Did he have a choice? Absolutely. He wished that his ministry would change the world. He wanted His teachings to change the hearts and minds of all those who heard Him. But He had the free will to march on when they hated Him. And He chose the path of courage toward the cross because He believed some things are worth dying for, and all things of God are worth dying for. And so the hymn calls us with these words, "Were the whole realm of nature mine, that were an offering far too small. Love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all." Our closing hymn is number 298. Let us stand.